Good afternoon. Some of you probably know me, some of you don't. My name's Richard Bowser. I'm the editor of Property Investor News, and we've got a very distinguished panel of specialists in shared accommodation, co-living, HMO, pick your moniker or whatever the term is. Far side, Ben Beadle, head of the National Residential Landlords Association. Daryn, sorry, ProPods, Portsmouth, yeah?
Yeah, got there.
Very experienced portfolio landlord. Wendy, Whittaker-Large, Stoke-on-Trent crew, very experienced portfolio landlord. And a last-minute substitute, Richard Blanco, again, HMO landlord, London-based. So you've got a lot of people with a wealth of experience, a lot of knowledge. A few days ago, they were listening to Liz Truss and Kwasi. Unfortunately, they've now got me to deal with. So we're here to talk about co-living, HMO, accommodation, shared living, and some of the issues and challenges in the marketplace that landlords have been and are going to have to deal with in the next year or so to make sense of what's happening and to deal with the challenges to their businesses. So that's what this panel is about. If you're in the wrong place, now is the time to leave. Right, Ben. You just come from the Conservative Party conference, a different experience from the previous week with the Labour conference. Can you just talk a little bit about what politically you have been hearing, seeing, and you know, for the shared living sector?
Yeah, with pleasure. I should add, I'm also a HMO landlord, have been a HMO I beg your pardon, I shall project my voice so you can all hear. No, it's just for the camera, isn't it?
Fortunately, they provided mics, but they're not linked for broadcasting. They're for the camera, which... Yeah.
So I'll have a go at speaking up, and hopefully everybody can hear me. I've been a HMO landlord for 20 years, as well as being the head of the NRLA. And I've spent a little bit of time these past 2 weeks in a political setting, as Richard has said. And I think the one thing that, or two things that strike me is that we have a government in crisis. It doesn't take an expert to work that out. But we also have a government that's very anti our sector, not uniquely shared living HMO sector, but our whole private rented sector, a massive downer on the very good work that goes on. And I think I'm not so sure I share the alternative view from the Tories that turning everybody into Generation Buy is going to solve all of our woes, not least the cost of mortgage debt increasing and likely to increase further, but also just in terms of the sentiment in our sector. This is a sentiment where landlords are thoroughly hacked off, where they don't want to stay and where they don't want to invest. And there will be those ideological few that say, well, what a great outcome, happy days. Well, my job is to point out the absolute disaster that would occur if we continue to see people leave the sector in the way that they are leaving it. And the only people that will suffer as a result of that, given current policy, are our good friends, the tenants. So at a time where we see rents increasing, at a time where we see supply diminishing, I think it's slightly fanciful that Generation Buy is a thing. Actually, what you need is a stable and effective private rented sector that enables those people to go on and buy their first home. I'm not anti-home ownership in any way, shape or form. I just think you have to be realistic about it. And if you add into the mix that we are the only country in the UK, as far as I'm aware, that continues to sell off our social housing stock, that just exacerbates things further. So, you know, I don't think the private rented sector is a bad place to be at all. On the contrary, I think it's a good place to be, and you'll be relieved to know we've got some great research coming out at the end of this month, independently done without any nobbling from me, that confirms that position, because we need to champion the sector that we are in, because if we don't, nobody else will do it for us.
Thanks for that. That set the scene. So, Wendy, you're a very experienced HMO landlord. Now, obviously, what Ben has talked about is the broader private rented sector and the politics and the backdrop, which I suppose should come as no great surprise, given what's been going on in the marketplace since about 2015 with the implementation of Section 24, the proposals around renters reform, which is one of the things maybe that Ben can talk a little bit more about as well. But in terms of the HMO shared accommodation, you're still pretty solidly positive, notwithstanding the current challenges. Yeah?
Do you mind if I stand up?
Yeah, no, by all means.
Yeah. So, in terms of what we're seeing in our market, and I actually speak to a lot of HMO investors and landlords across the country, demand has never been higher. How many of you in the room already have an HMO? Okay, and how many are looking to invest in more HMOs? Okay, so just from that very short straw poll, we can see there's still a huge willingness and an interest in HMOs, which I think is very powerful. And I'm really pleased to see it, actually, because I too totally believe in HMOs. I think they're a very powerful force in the private rental sector. I think they provide accommodation at a level, at actually many different levels. You have ProPods, which is Daryn's company, offering very high quality co-living. You also have people at the lower end of the sector who, yes, we might look at their HMOs and say, well, they're not exactly Instagram friendly, but what they are is affordable accommodation for a part of the market. So I'm very, very much in favour of HMOs, and I think that what we're seeing now, because of the shrinkage of the PRS and because a number of landlords are scared, and I'll come on to what I believe are the 4 reasons why they're scared, I think this actually is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to work within a shrinking market because there is more demand than ever. But I think there are challenges. So although we might see a huge amount of demand, and in fact our occupancy rates are about 99.5% at the moment, I've got a portfolio of 200 rooms, and I think we only have 1 or 2 rooms available today. So that just goes to show just how much demand there is. And remember, I invest up north, Crewe and Stoke-on-Trent, where it's not that nice, I tell you. And we still got lots of demand.
That suits you.
Thank you very much, thank you. I might adopt it for a future talk. Anyway, but I think there are 4 things over the next year which are affecting landlords, and I think are affecting them now. The 2 I's, inflation and interest rates. And as we know, the 2 are very closely linked, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the sort of economic factors over the next year. But I think interest rates are obviously taking a knock on people's confidence because they're worried about the cost of servicing their mortgage. They're worried about how much leverage they should take out of their HMO, particularly maybe on the first refinance, which means they're then worried about their cash flow in the future. But of course, as has already been referred to, it's going to be tenants that will probably ultimately pick up that increase. Inflation is obviously affecting house prices as well. There's no doubt that if you look at historical charts of money supply, when the money supply grows, particularly the M2 money supply, we find house prices start to go up relative to the M2 money supply. And we're seeing further evidence of that being provided over the last 10 days with the government, 2 weeks ago, when the government announced the sort of almost, it's kind of like a cap on energy bills. It's really like a subsidy to all of us in energy. And we don't know how much that's going to cost us. Currently, the estimate is £200 billion in additional government debt. That's going to just be added to the government debt that's already there. But that also is interesting in terms of interest rates, how high they can go, because interest rates affects the way our government services its own debt. And if interest rates get too high, or there is a risk that they're going to go high, again, as we saw as a result after the economic statement, the Bank of England had to step in. It had to bring down long-term yield control on bonds because those bonds were suddenly going incredibly expensive. And of course, that's why we see mortgage rates start to go up as well as a result of that. So interest and inflation, I think, are 2 areas, and I could talk all afternoon about them, but I won't. I think the other one is council tax on HMO rooms, which we might have a little bit of time to discuss. Absolutely. I think that is a threat to the market, and you might know that we have formed a reform group, HMO and council tax reform group, to fight this unjust tax. We've got some briefing papers with us. If you are interested in the topic, please come and pick one up at the end of the session. And the 4th area, I can't quite remember, I thought about it, it's gone out of my head, it'll probably come back to me. But it was interest, inflation, council tax and HMOs, and some other one, which we'll probably come on to later.
I'm sure we'll get to it.
Regulation.
Okay.
Probably, I can't remember.
Wendy, thanks for that. Daryn, come on to you in a minute, and specifically we'll go into the council tax banding, perhaps So Richard, we've heard a little bit from Wendy, whose portfolio is up in the northwest. Richard, very much portfolio lander down here in primarily East London, is that right?
Yes, in East London, where we're kind of swimming in Article 4 directions, as any of you who are East London landlords will know. So you have to get planning permission for shared accommodation if you don't already have sharers in there. So that's across something like 10 boroughs across East London. So that's a huge frustration for London landlords. And also the inflation in licensing fees, I think, has been a big topic for London landlords as well. But the market has been very active. Rents have been going up. There's huge demand for HMOs in London. And those of us who've already got HMOs, of course, glad that we got them when we did, because it'd be quite hard, in boroughs like Newham and Barking and Dagenham and so on, to have HMOs now, because some of those boroughs just won't give planning permission for HMOs. And that, of course, is very frustrating for landlords and tenants alike, because as Wendy has said, the HMO sector can provide affordable accommodation. And, I've sat at meetings at the Greater London Authority where one of the members has said, has listened to a nurse saying she has to commute in from Chelmsford because she can't afford to live in London. And then I've raised the issue of Article 4 and preventing us from letting to sharers, and they said, we need to protect family housing. And of course the two things just don't connect, do they? So that's fairly typical of the sort of unjoined up thinking that I think we're seeing. In terms of issues going forward, of course interest rates are going to be a big issue, and I was looking today at HMO mortgage rates. 2-year fixed with TMW, 6.79% now. It's really gone up, and those of course rates were normal kind of 15-20 years ago, but we're absolutely not used to those sorts of rates now. So that's going to be a really big issue going forward. And then of course the Renters Reform Bill, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but the impact on the student sector, which many HMOs sit in, is going to be a big issue, because with periodic tenancies you won't be able to let properties for 9 or 12 months as we currently can. So, and I'm also very interested in the difference between shared houses on 1AST and houses let as bedsits by the room, and I would really like to see those treated very differently, and I would like to see Article 4 directions and the C4 planning use class restricted to just HMOs of 5 people or more, and I think it's very odd that a council can tell you whether someone who's related or unrelated can live in your property. It seems to be that in a democracy that's a very strange and peculiar power that we give to local authorities. So for me and for landlords in East London in HMOs, that's a very live issue.
Okay, I've remembered my fourth one.
Right, quick.
Energy.
I was thinking,
energy. That was
well, you've got plenty of that.
More than the country.
Right, so just picking up on a point that when Richard just made. So last night I went to, and this is very relevant to what's just been said. So last night I was invited to the opening of a large build-to-rent scheme over in northwest London. 350 units, predominantly studios. I think the mix is 75% studios, 28 square metres. So we're not talking about very large units here. Incredible spec, incredible attention to detail. 350 units were all put to the lettings market and have all been let in 90 days. Now that underpins the demand in northwest London, or that particular pocket of northwest London. And I was talking to a portfolio landlord earlier, and I mentioned this, and he said, well, I'm based around there. And I said, what do you think these rooms are let for? And when I told him, he went, $13.50 a month. One bed's $17.50 a month. So that's incredibly strong demand. Now this is build to rent co-living, so they're basically, very, very, high level HMO co-living. But it just shows the strength of demand. Now, Daryn, you do a higher end co-living.
You're not
quality.
quite that high.
No,
Now thinking maybe I shouldn't be on the panel, to be honest.
Well, this is a 17-story building, but I get. So yeah, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of demand down in Portsmouth?
So in Portsmouth we have Article 4. So that creates its own interesting things. I'm a developer that mainly builds in high streets, so even though we have Article 4, I'm not quite sure what family home we're taking out of a commercial building, but that's a different conversation for a different day. We're very top end. I would say we're a niche within a niche. We're not for everybody, but we appreciate that the HMO market has a place for everybody, depending on whatever budget that is. And we understand that that is no different from buying a cheap car to buying a dear car. That's the same scenario. But what we are seeing, demand is ridiculous. You know, my latest 7-bed, my property manager rented within 10 days, was getting more room rates than we've ever seen throughout the whole portfolio. We're seeing tenants, bizarrely, happy to take the council tax on bedrooms. I think that's an interesting conversation that's going on at the moment. And for some of you in this room will probably know that I'm really chomping at the bit to get the government to change that legislation. But what we're seeing is interestingly, is that actually people are coming out of 1-bed flats and coming into co-living. And even though I wasn't with the NRLA at conference, I was at the conference for 3 days. Ben and I heard some horrendous things come out of ministers' mouths. But also what they don't get is that actually co-living and HMO actually frees up 1 and 2 bedroom flats for the local community. And I think that is something that the government hasn't quite realised. The renters reform, what are we calling it at the moment? Consultation? Because it's not a bill, is it? White paper. Looks a bit dirty, but it's a white paper. Doesn't, as far as I'm aware, mention the word HMO once. And that concerns me. You know, the government doesn't quite realise what's going on out there. We believe that there's probably 3 million sharers within England and Wales, and not once did HMO mentioned. So what is the government trying to get at is that no one wants to live in shared living. We saw shared living 25 years ago when Friends hit our TVs. That was really Joey, Ross, Chandler, Phoebe, and someone else I've missed. Is something that we saw 25 years ago, and we probably didn't realise then actually what we were seeing in front of us. And that today is what is happening. You know, we are a community. You know, we call our ProPod tenants Propodians. They're all part of the ProPod community, and they enjoy it. You know, because it's a way of living. It helps mental health. But coming back to your original question, demand is flying, and I'll be honest with you, it doesn't sit comfortable with me. I'm concerned that tenants are having to rush out and pay inflated rents. And long term, as a developer, I have some slight concerns about that, especially with the council tax adding probably 20% to someone's rent. That is not going to the developer or the owner.
Okay, the reason I'm picking up on what was said about demand incredibly strong, because obviously this panel was labelled in terms of the challenges, and we are all aware, as has already been outlined, that there are undoubtedly some challenges that need to be addressed and need to be thought through in terms of meeting those challenges in terms of your respective businesses, your HMO property businesses. So, let's not go too much on the doom and gloom, as has already been outlined, and I'm sure many of you will be aware. Demand is very strong, and rents, the rental path is clearly on an upward curve. And of course, one of the reasons behind that is the lack of build. There is just, and this is across the broader private rented sector, that there is just not enough build occurring, and there hasn't been. There's a lot of coverage, particularly in the mass media, about build to rent, but the proportion, the numbers of build to rent schemes that are actually being created, in fact, it's starting to level off. There's an awful lot supposedly in planning, but it's not actually being built. So there's lots of things to be positive about, apart from the obvious challenges. Now, one of the sectors where build to rent has been growing quite strongly is the student sector. So, Ben, you're a portfolio landed. What's been the impact for you? What are you seeing in the student HMO sector?
So I let my properties on one tenancy rather than individual rooms, and I think, what do I think? I think the things that are in the planning when it comes to changing to a periodic tenancy will absolutely decimate the sector. I can't put it any more positively than that. I'm being filmed. So this is a key campaigning area for us, because actually the student sector works quite well. The argument around some of the proposed changes to come out in the white paper, I can understand to a point. But I don't get this, because the argument around a periodic tenancy is that it gives tenants the kind of mobility to vote with their feet if they move into a property, it's substandard, they can move on. Link that with the possession changes, it also gives people security, because the proposed changes will not allow landlords to get possession of their property with Section 21 going unless there is a legitimate reason. So it's a more secure tenure. No student I have ever rented to wants security at the end of that lease. They all want to go and work in the city, wherever it happens to be. They've fallen out with all their mates. They don't want to be in my beautiful property, even though they've loved it. They want to go out and see the wide world. So the argument I do not accept, and Eddie Hughes has told me this directly. I beg your pardon, sorry, I'm banging on the table, apologies.
Passionate. That's no bad
I can't
thing.
help it. It gets.
He's representing you guys, so he needs to have some passion.
Well, it's irritating because, you know, government is likely to make a very significant error here, and Eddie Hughes has told me directly that he doesn't want to single out a particular group of people. The good news is that Eddie Hughes actually isn't now a minister, and so we have a huge opportunity now to really influence the direction of travel when it comes to the white paper. Obviously, the circumstances of the past few weeks has meant that there's been a real state of flux. But we are getting in with ministers to make these points. My in terms of where I think we are at the moment, I don't know where the government believes it to be in terms of the white paper. But I've heard lots of comments at the Tory conference of the need to crack on with it. So I really want to change the direction of travel here. If it's good enough for the purpose-built student accommodation sector to have fixed terms and able to bring the tenancy to an end, then it's good for us, and that is the point I'm making.
That's a very solid point. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you are student landlords? Okay. We'll open up the questions in a minute from the audience, but for the moment, just trying to think what energy. Yes,
Yeah.
let's a little bit about energy. Obviously, the government made an announcement, and obviously that's potentially going to cost significant sums for taxpayers. But what are your thoughts on energy in terms of? Because Daryn, we touched on this in the interview that I did with you, didn't we, a few months ago, about what you're doing with your particular properties. But Wendy, if you could set the broader scene, and then Daryn, perhaps you could just tell what you're doing with your properties. Yeah.
Well, again, it was very interesting because I was at the conference as well with these two guys, and you know, there was a lot of discussion about energy, and you've probably seen in the news today that there's been an announcement by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's the energy or the business minister, to start to release more licences for exploration of new sites in the North Sea, and also to open up new gas pipelines, or new gas sources, I suppose, in the North Sea, because we realise that energy is, of course, not only an issue that affects businesses, it affects people, it affects our tenants, it obviously affects our economy as well in a very big way, and of course it's also about our security. So it's a very political sort of hot potato, well, lukewarm potato at the moment because we can't heat it up. But I think that in terms of HMOs, I think there are some real challenges, because historically I've always offered all-inclusive rent. And many of you, I'm sure, do exactly the same thing. It's one rent and it covers all your bills. And that's been one of our selling points, hasn't it? That we've said, you don't have to worry about anything. When you come and live in one of our HMO rooms, everything's covered. Your utility bills, your water, your broadband, your TV, even cleaning. Happy days. And of course that's great because the tenant gets security. They know how much they're paying. There are no changes to their monthly direct debit or standing order. Whereas now, as landlords, we're beginning to look at our energy bills and going, good grief, we can't live with this anymore, we're going to have to do something. So I think there are some practical things that we can do, and Daryn might want to come on to that. I certainly think that using some technology helps. So all of our properties are on remote controllable heating systems to allow us to control the heating remotely. So we're trying to be generous, but we're also recognising that we have to also control the heating, very much so. But the other thing is educating tenants. Most of our tenants, the average age of our tenant is 29 years of age. We've done quite a lot of data mining to find out lots of detail about who we rent to. The average length of stay is 21 months, the average rental is £520 a month, and the average age is 29. That's just our portfolio. Now, interestingly, that is the age group of many young people who are very determined to see changes to how we produce energy and how we utilise energy, and they can be what I might call the climate warriors. They're often the ones who, want us to become more environmentally friendly and more ecological. And yet, I'm afraid I also see slight sort of hypocritical behaviour, because they're often the ones who have the heating turned up full and the windows open. Yeah? Anyone else experienced that? So what we're trying to do is actually educate our tenants to recognise that their behaviour has a direct impact on the environment. It isn't just what governments do, it isn't just what landlords do, it isn't just what the local authority does, it's what they do that matters. And actually, if we're going to go through this time and all survive and be okay, we all have a responsibility to recognise that we can turn down the thermostat by a couple of degrees, we can put on a warm jumper, we don't have to have the heating on all day and all night to survive. Yes, there might be some times of the day or night when we need to have it on, but other times there are other ways to stay warm. So I think we are going to go through a transition period, and I actually don't think it's a bad thing. To be honest, I think this has been coming down the line for a long time, where we're going to have to understand that crosshair between becoming more environmentally friendly, looking at different sources of energy, but recognising that if we're going to go down that route, there is a cost and there is going to be pain, and we are all going to have to bear it if that's the direction of travel we want to take.
Thank you, Wendy. Right, Richard, did you want to just add anything about how you're dealing with in your properties and
yes, it might be useful,
communication, customer communication?
I'm just thinking I'm in a different space to Wendy, because I only let on joint ASTs, so I don't let by the room, and in fact I really want low management, low maintenance, so that's why I don't let by the room, because I know that requires more input from the landlord and the manager, and so all of my tenants pay their own bills, and so I've never let properties on a bills included sort of business model, and I'm kind of really glad I haven't, of course, because of where we're at now. So I would strongly recommend you don't go down that route. But,
who is doing bills included in the room? Okay, and who's not? That are HMOs. Okay, so slight majority of bills included. And,
it's interesting. We did do a podcast, the NRLA podcast, Listen Up Landlords. We did one on this recently on bills inclusive rents, and one of the landlords that had as a case study told us that he had felt pressured by the agent to have bills inclusive rents, because the agent was working with a kind of utilities consolidator that wanted to sort of manage all the bills and so on, and that if you were the only landlord that wasn't renting bills inclusive, then students wouldn't want to let with you. So that seemed to be wrong to me, really, and it seems that there should be choice around that. I guess my concern has been trying to increase rents. I'm one of the 60 to 70% of landlords, I think, who have tenants and haven't increased the rent for years because the tenants have stayed for so long. So it can feel quite difficult increasing rents at the moment, even though people's rents have fallen well below market rent. So I've definitely been doing things like £50 increases when really the market rent is 200, 300 more. And I'm waiting really for tenants to start to say that they're having difficulties because of the cost of utility bills, but that hasn't happened yet.
That's good to hear. Before we open up to the room, and we're bringing about renters reform between you guys as well. But Daryn, just a little bit more detail about what you've been doing with your
I'm going to
customers.
I'm going to be 2 minutes because I'm sure there's a lot of questions to ask. all of ours are brand new converted properties, so it might surprise people that out of a £250,000 refurb budget, we probably spend about 10% of that on insulation. So that is key for me. We are insulating the hell out of these buildings, and it's working. We've brought in some technology. We use a particular company that is a landlord technology thermostat provider. That works very well. The tenants seem to like that. We're also starting to put solar panels on roofs as well. But we are launching the ProPod cost of living debate, and it's something that we want to bring in our Propodians to talk about, because Wendy's right, radiators on and the windows open. I mean, you might as well have a car and the fuel coming out of it, isn't you, at the same time? So, yes, we are very strong on that. I think the time has come to have that conversation. I think tenants are realising that time has come. I think our young generation, 21 to 35, majority of ours are under 30, so Generation Z, as we call them, are probably realising that the energy crisis that we have as a world is they have a little part to play. And everyone has a minute part to play, because if everyone plays that part, it becomes a bigger picture, and the solution gets resolved. So, we're very keen on discussing it. It's not something I'm shying away from. Some tenants don't want to have the conversation, but the majority we're finding do.
Thanks, Darren. Okay, so there's so much, obviously, that we could potentially talk about. That there are lots of you in front of me, and lots of you have already identified that you are HMO co-living landlords. So, questions from what you've heard already, or maybe some questions that the panel have not yet mentioned. Who wants to ask a question and raise something in terms of the challenges that you are seeing in your HMO businesses? Anyone got a question? Hands up, please.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
So thank you for your insights. I just got into property last year. We've got 16 student HMO rooms, predominantly in Coventry, but also Middlesbrough. So I'll appreciate your insights later, Wendy, about Middlesbrough. But with the rental reforms, what would your suggestions be? And I know it's very hard to answer it without knowing how things are going to progress, but for someone who's new to the HMO situation, is it best to sort of start investing away from student HMOs and look at possibly professional HMO-lets? Or would you suggest that it's unlikely and the government may actually listen to yourselves and say, well, actually this is not going to happen, and it's best to stick with the student HMO? Because one of the reasons I've decided to do that is because of the council tax concerns, because one of our HMOs is a 5-bed, 5-en-suite, and so I'm worried about that individual council tax banding issue as well. So it kind of seems to be stuck between a hard place and a rock.
Can I answer the ensuite part?
Yeah, carry on.
Ben, you might want to do the first bit.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Go on, you do that.
I'll just jump in very quickly and say, I mean, I personally wouldn't change my strategy. I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon. Ooh. Bit weary. I may look young, but I've got the back of an 80-year-old. So what I would say to you is, I personally wouldn't change my strategy. What the operating environment is, or what could be, will be. You know, we will have a bloody good go at trying to change it. Of course we will. But, you know, I wouldn't deviate away from the areas that you have chosen for those reasons. You will adapt. The one thing I know about landlords is that they will adapt. And the other thing I would say is this, is just because we end up in a periodic tenancy type basis, the average tenancy length is 4.3 years in the UK, right? We have a housing crisis where there's not enough supply, and if somebody comes to you and is desperately unhappy in their tenancy, what are you going to do? You're probably going to let them move on, I would suggest. So I personally wouldn't worry too much about the periodic element. Where I would worry is your grounds for repossession under antisocial behaviour, which do not work. So there's two things that I'm pressing on with at the moment in terms of lobbying. That is an exemption for student tenancies, because the government have already exempted the purpose-built providers. There is no justification for singling out the individual landlord, no justification at all, and it won't work. It will decrease supply, it will create real problems for people in a way that we don't have at the moment. You know when your property is going to be available, and as a tenant, you won't have any certainty whatsoever. So it will potentially force a change in dynamic, but also force a change in cost, because you would just recost it accordingly. And then the antisocial behaviour one, the ground as is proposed is too high. It requires a criminal conviction in return for a mandatory ground, and that's too high a test. Who are you going to get to, to support your case? You're not. So we would like to see a much lower test on that, and I remain hopeful, because MPs' post bags are full of antisocial behaviour type complaints, and they won't want to deal with them. So I think, if there's going to be some movement, it will be there.
Yeah. So
I think coming back to the question of council tax, that's probably my speciality at the moment. Do you want me to stand up?
yes.
So I think in terms of council tax, I think the myth of en-suites are the only thing that get rebanded. That's a myth. You don't have to have en-suites. You don't have to have kitchenettes. You could just have a room with an individual tenancy, and that could potentially get rebounded. And I say could, the likelihood is will.
Yeah.
So this whole perception out in the landlord market is, I don't want to put my head above the parapet because I don't want my property to be found. I have a saying, and Wendy's heard it many times, the train has left the station and we are all on different platforms. Yeah, and depending on what platform you're on, that train is going to collect you, and that train is the VOA. That is the only way of describing it. Because I got en suites and all my 68 bedrooms have been rebanded within a year. I mean, to give you some idea, our portfolio now is costing our tenants £71,000 a year in council tax, and that's just my portfolio. So we know this is a big problem. I've even seen student HMOs get rebanded because the VOA have had lack of information, and they've just gone gun-ho and rebanded student properties. And then the landlord has to then unpick that with the student, with the local authority, and it's a car crash. So the myth of, I haven't got en suites, so I'm fine, that is a myth. And we've seen that already. One of our committee members, who is from Barnsley, I can't do the accent, but from Barnsley.
Well, I don't think he's from Barnsley himself, but he's just got an HMO there.
So he's got HMO in Barnsley, and he's got a 4-bed, and that's been rebanded with no en suites. So yes, I'm not trying to get our group out there more, but if those want to come and have a chat with us and get the white paper here, it's a very interesting development that we are seeing within the council tax problem.
Sorry, when you say rebind, does it mean that those 4 beds each have the council tax?
Yes. So each bedroom will get rebanded as a band A. The liability to the landlord then gets taken away. And then the liability gets added to the tenant. The VOA and the local authority have the right, if they have proof, to backdate that bill. So we are now having tenants chased for backdated council tax that they don't even know they owe.
This is a big issue, and I seriously encourage you to talk to Daryn and Wendy about that, because the work that they're doing to try and lobby to get this changed, it really does need as much support as possible from the HMO.
And if I can give you some idea, I spoke to 3 housing ministers or ministers within the housing team, and I also spoke to someone from the local government association, who obviously looks after all the local councils, and none of them were aware. None of them. No, none of them are aware. And this is one of the reasons I went to the conference, was to make this point. This is the poll tax for those who are old enough in this room to remember. This could be the poll tax for returning for up to 3 million sharers in the UK or England and Wales. So we have a big lobbying to do. I think it's doable. Ben and the NRLA are on board with this. They think it's doable, and we think it also revolves around the renters reform and the decent home standards that's coming out. So
and cost of living.
And cost of living. You know, we're hearing about rent controls potentially being looked at. Scotland have given it. Wales are discussing it. It's probably coming down south. And it's all right for us to not be able to charge tenants the market rent, but it's acceptable for the UK government to charge council tax on a bedroom that on average is 13, 14 square metres and doesn't meet self-contained standards. That is shocking. And that has to stop.
Can I just say as well, Richard,
Yeah.
this issue of ministers not being aware is the same with Article 4, I think. That I remember we had a minister at an NLA, as it was then, conference, and I put a question to him about Article 4, and he didn't know what I was talking about. And it obviously has a huge impact on people in the HMO sector, but, very cleverly, these things are brought in that are so complicated that journalists don't really understand, ministers don't really understand, because they're never in their jobs long enough to kind of get their heads around it, and that these things then stay with us for a generation or more. So.
Well, and also special advisors take them away from the new ministers. The special advisors, the advisors to government, the secretaries, the civil service do understand, but they do not want to share that information or that knowledge with ministers.
My question is that if ministers don't understand, who actually is it? Who's creating
Okay.
this nonsense?
Yeah, go on.
So, I think there's two things. I mean, I think you've got to look at Wendy's come up with 21 months as the average stay. Ben's got 4.7 years. How many ministers have we had? Housing ministers? I mean, I think we've had 21 ministers in 4.7 years. So I think that is the problem. I think I've spoken to a civil servant privately who has told me that I'm making a fuss about this council tax policy. Yeah, there is no appetite to change this policy. But here is something shocking, that every time a bedroom gets classified as council tax, we believe it gets added to the UK housing numbers. Now that is shocking if that is the case. It's statistics.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, local governments receive payment from central government when they create a new dwelling.
Corruption.
So it is. It is corruption.
It's added to the numbers.
Absolute corruption.
It's fraud. It's fraud onto the voter, saying that we've got to build 3 million houses in a year. Yeah. Well, there's 3 million shared renters. Well, that's a tick in the box. The local government, the local council gets something called New Homes Council Tax Bonus Scheme. They get given a bonus for every dwelling they create. So if I could tell you, for instance, in my city, in Portsmouth, we've got probably around about 20,000 rooms in general, and their target for the city is 24,000 dwellings. Well, I'm not a rocket scientist, but they're getting there. And yet, when we've been to conference, the first thing is it's top down, isn't it? We need more properties being built. How do we do it? Well, actually, there's a little loophole, and they don't realise that loophole's going on. So this is a massive point. Richard has brought me in today on the panel. He's also interviewed me recently. We are getting more traction on it, but the more people that join our Facebook group, the more we can stop this.
Is there any way of getting a big national publisher to pronounce on this?
I can't say too much. We're working on that now.
Right.
We're working on that.
Slowly. Well,
Does
okay.
the generation rent know about this council tax?
Generation rent.
Yeah,
So-
generation rent. Because
Ben?
they
Yes.
make a lot of noise.
Yes.
Then if they know that this will impact on their pocket, hopefully they'll talk to the government because they're very shouty, they talk too much.
They're more shouty. I'm not sure they have a great deal of influence with the government, but they are shouty. And I think one of the things that we've agreed, certainly over a beer at conference, is that I can take that to Baroness Kennedy and talk about that in terms that it's an industry kind of solution. Because the more that we can work together on some of these and it is niche, it is a bit niche to be honest with you, and that's why ministers that have come and go will probably look at it and think, well, crap, this is really a bit difficult to get my head round, and before you know it, they're out the door. So it's a very, very niche issue, and I think what we have at the moment is the ideal opportunity to be able to put that in a cost of living context and work collaboratively with partners like Generation Rent and others to force the issue. So that's what we're going to do.
Thanks, Ben. Just going back to the student sector, I mean, we did an Ask in Property Investor News 4, 5, 6 months ago, just talking about demographics and the trends, and it's the forward from where we are now is much more positive. So because of the demographics in the UK, there are many, many more 18-year-olds coming into the student sector in the next few years. So there's a positive. There is obviously quite strong demand, and we're looking at an article to talk to portfolio student landlords of what's happening this term. And of course the other impact in the student sector is international coming into the UK, because with COVID obviously lots of Asian students in particular that were coming over found it much more difficult to get over in the last few years, but that trend seems to be reversing. So yeah, I think there are positives to take out from...
Can I also give
Yeah,
a
carry
positive
on.
though? Because I've probably spoken too much. It should have been a Daryn Brewer debate. I think there is a lot of positives out there. You know, I'm not stopping my brand, my business from growing. You know, we have a target of 500 rooms. We're at 100. I'm not stopping because of the council tax. I didn't know, we didn't stop for Section 24, even though Ben and I agree that that is something, and a lot of people, that should be gone. But we found a way around it. You know, I think as landlords, we're very good at putting a plaster on ourselves, letting it heal, and going again. But I think there is a lot of landlords now in England and Wales, and I think this is the time where landlords can come together. You know, for instance, on the council tax, this is a tax on the tenant and the landlord. Tax on the tenant's not been seen. I can't remember the last time a tenant was taxed. You know, and now we're seeing it. So I think tenants have a part to play. I think landlords definitely have a part to play. NRLA have a part to play. Us as a lobbying group. But do you know what? People power. You know, when I remember as a kid when Maggie announced poll tax and riots in London were huge, it got stopped straight away. You know, and the Local Government Finance Act was created within a matter of weeks. So it does show that. I'm seeing tenants financially become unstable. But guys, we are good. You know, the rogue landlords out there that the government thinks exist is probably not in this room. You know, it's probably a 5% of the market, and it's the 5% of the market that the government's trying to eradicate that's affecting the other 95% of us. So I'm very much pro-landlord. I'm very much pro what we do. I'm proud of what we do. When someone says to me, are you a landlord? Yes, I am. But I'm actually now thinking to myself, am I a private rental provider? Because maybe PRP is a better word for a landlord. You know, I'm part of the PRS and I'm a PRP. You know, all right. Yeah, well, Ben's back.
Okay, what is with hands up, because we've only got 6-7 minutes left. So any more burning questions? You've heard a lot, and as Daryn said, a lot from Daryn. He's obviously very passionate like Ben. So anyone else got any burning questions about what you've just heard? Yes.
Yeah, Richard.
Yes.
Richard, what's the difference between having like 4 tenants in one tenancy and renting out rooms? How does the council deal with it? Is it still classified as HMO or not?
Yes, I mean, it's still classed as an HMO if you have 3 or more people living in 2 or more households. One of the tricky things I find with councils are things like fire safety issues. So, for example, if you've got sharers on one contract, if there are 3 or 4 sharers, then and it's a 2-storey Victorian house, then you probably don't need fire doors if they're sharers. But if you rented it by the room, you probably would need fire doors. And it's often local authorities don't understand those kinds of differences. So that's, you know, I have to make sure I get a professional fire risk assessment done and explain to the officer when they come round, you know, any issues that they don't understand. So I find a lot of frustrations with councils around that. But it's, I find it, you know, basically I end up with 3 or 4 sharers that live as a family, really. And I would challenge the basis on which we define HMOs as being related or unrelated people, because I think, you know, 3 or 4 close friends living together are in effect a kind of 21st century family, and that's why I'd like us to look again at some point about the definition of an HMO. Yeah.
Yeah, why I ask is that my properties are mainly in Lewisham, southeast of London. There's 3 people, more than 2 people that classify it as HMO, you need a license. So how do we deal with yours? I know you're in East London, probably local council, but in Lewisham, once it's more than 3 people not related, they're classified as...
Yes, Lewisham has an additional licensing scheme. So if you've got 3 or 4 people in the property, it's the most expensive in the country, I think, as well, the Lewisham additional licensing scheme, then you will need an additional license. If it's 5 or more, then obviously you need a mandatory HMO license,
More questions? Okay. Yes. Chatham King shirt, and I'll come to you over there. Sorry.
So I came a bit late, so apologies if you've already answered this. But in terms of the rent caps, how are they proposing to go about valuing rooms, or how is it happening in Scotland?
I would say that's for the UK government to work out, not for me to tell them. In Scotland, they're about to bring it in. As you know, we don't cover Scotland, but we are joining forces with SAL, the Scottish Association of Landlords, to commission, probably breaching an embargo now, but to commission legal advice on a legal challenge, so that any government in Wales or England thinks twice about it. That's why we're joining forces. But seriously, I think it's really tricky to do without grossly interfering with the market. And I don't know if you've seen what ministers have said recently, but they are not, the Tory government have said they are not in favour of rent increases for new tenancies. That's what they've said. And that I'm pleased with that, because I think that would be the trickiest thing for them to try and control, which is the price that a property comes to the market at. The scary bit about that point is that they're clearly looking at in-tenancy increases, but as Richard rightly observes, about knocking on for 70% of landlords do not increase their rents in tenancy anyway. So I'm not saying I'm ambivalent about it. We must defend against rent caps to the hilt. This is about supply, not about rent caps. And so if the government really wants to sort out the price of rents, it must commit to social housing. It must unlock the private rented sector as being a force for good, reversing Section 24, scrapping the additional stamp duty land tax, and it cannot solely rely on people buying homes, because it ain't going to happen and they'll be voted out.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Right, lady with the blue dress, top.
My question is for Richard. It's on planning permission. So you mentioned earlier about in East London there's quite a lot of boroughs that it's quite difficult to get planning permission for them. I'm looking to go into East London, maybe not at the right time, but I mean, how would you recommend kind of finding out beforehand the boroughs kind of their allowance?
Yes, it's quite a challenge actually. I mean, the issue is that there are two planning use classes, C3 and C4. C3 is a dwelling house, so everyone in that has to be related. C4 is an HMO, so that would be 3 or more people in 2 or more households. And what's happened is all of the boroughs in East London have got Article 4 directions which prevent you from having a C4, that this is an HMO, without getting planning permission. Now, some of them just have a blanket ban on offering planning permission. So, for example, Newham has had that, and that's been upheld by the planning inspectorate. But some boroughs are more lenient, so Barking and Dagenham, I think, are. Waltham Forest have very particular criteria, so I think you can only have an HMO to the north of the North Circular. So you'd have to do quite a lot of research on what each borough's position is and try and work out which is the best borough to go into. I mean, it could be worthwhile, because obviously we're going to see fewer and fewer HMOs in East London because of Article 4 directions. But do be aware that some are very rigorous on enforcement. So Newham, for example, Redbridge have got very rigorous on enforcement. And also remember that the licensing regime is different to planning. So you can be given an HMO licence and then told by planning that you must evict your tenants, and then you have to pay for a selective licence, so you've paid twice. So, be very careful.
Can I just quickly add to that? So C4 is up to 6 people.
Oh, that's true.
Okay,
yes,
not bedrooms, people.
Yeah.
Majority of our propods are sui generis, which is a different planning altogether out there for 7 or more people. My advice would be, if you're new to that area, find a planning consultant in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it could be very costly of buying a property and then not getting your planning. Especially when you paid a 3% surge charge in stamp duty, it'd probably be best to use a planning consultant. That would be my advice.
If you're an NRLA member, there's a bit of kit called CAMA that looks at all of the licensing regimes across local authorities, and it would be well worth you having a little look at that.
What's that called again?
CAMA. K-A-M-M-A. It's free to NRLA members. Just log on to your account and you will be able to see it.
Well, I've learn't something new today.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah,
Take the shirt off my back.
Oh, I'm sold.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you, audience, for participating. Thank you, panel. Take a bow. And round of applause.